Mawson was an excellent salesman, and Mawson was an excellent and very, very persuasive speaker. He was a charismatic individual. He must have, I could just imagine that salesman pitch he made in 1912 to the Town Planning Commission. I can just imagine the effect of an orator like that, planning for the future. He just blew them away. I mean, they were just captivated by him.
You know, he was a visionary and he caught his audience at the right time, and so they responded to the vision.
Out here on the prairie, I think the idea would have been to aim high, and I think he did aim high, and I'm certain that the city fathers at the time thought that they got what they paid for.
The city of Calgary, once a small prairie community, grew by leaps and bounds in the early part of the 20th century. So much so that in 1912, Thomas Mawson, an English landscape architect and town planner, was commissioned to prepare a preliminary scheme to direct the growth of the city. Mawson would eventually supply the City Planning Commission with 30 sketches and line drawings, together with a book entitled Calgary, Past, Present, and Future.
By 1912, when Calgary was at the top of its boom, you know, it was a 40 jump from 3,000 in 1900 to 50,000 in 1911. That's a tremendous jump. And when Mawson arrived in Calgary, it was to a city that had a dire need of services, of his services. It was a very bustling, crowded, dusty, dirty, even misshapen city. The sobriquet, Calgary the Sandstone City, is in many ways misleading because it speaks of grandeur and it speaks of urban sophistication. And yes, there were some fine blocks in Calgary. Yes, there were. There were some fine pieces of architecture in the downtown area, and there were fine pieces of architecture in the houses. But generally, Calgary was a complete mishmash. There was overcrowding, there were housing shortages, the roads were crooked, there was an increasing population influx into a city that was scarcely able to handle it.
Calgary really just getting underway with the building of the fort in 1875 and the late development. It's really growing as a city just when people have begun to propose solutions to some of these problems. So while Calgary hadn't developed the problems yet, it was pretty small potatoes as a settlement. Yet with Mawson's plan, had the benefit of some of the thinking about the solutions that were being pushed ahead in places like St. Louis and New York and Chicago particularly. There was a lot of excitement around Chicago from the 1870s up, to the period we've been talking about. And both in New York and Chicago, they developed the steel-framed skyscraper and took advantage of Eli Otis's safety elevator to make possible the building of high-rise buildings in a way that was not at this stage being contemplated in Europe. So Chicago and New York, but Chicago notably led the way with some very significant buildings and the ability then to begin to build a very concentrated downtown where you had hundreds and thousands of people concentrated on a relatively small area of land.
There was a growing interest in all North American cities of the value of town planning. This was an age of panaceas, an age where people thought that problems could be solved for the better. Things would get better if people had the foresight, the energy, and the money to apply the tools of science.
It was an age of optimism in many ways, or an age of boosterism, and boosterism and the optimism tended to ignore the sprawl and ignore the squalor. But the boosters saw it as an age of optimism. And it was realised about 1912 that Calgary had a problem with growth and with the way the city was moving, and it needed to be fixed. And it needed to be fixed by invoking the new magic tool of town planning. And so Calgary was casting around for a town planner, I think as early as 1910, or maybe even earlier. They were casting around for a town planner. He would be American, or it would be he, and he would be American, or he'd be a Brit. No other one would do, preferably a Brit. And so when Thomas Mawson, who was trained in landscape architecture and horticulture and draftsman type drawings, when he came through on a tour west in 1912, he was asked to speak to a group of interested citizens in Calgary.
And Calgary was full of enthusiasm and great dreams, and what Mawson did was provide glorious images to support those dreams. So his real success, and Calgary was his most significant, largest Canadian project, his real success was as a visionary who provided very specific graphic images to support the kinds of ambitions that Calgarians and the Calgary Town Council had for this place.
Calgary's phenomenal growth between 1885 and 1912, the year Mawson first visited the city, was a period that transformed the centre from one of simplicity to urban sophistication. In 1884, the year the city was incorporated, rudimentary beginnings of a town emerged with unpaved roads and the beginnings of a wooden sidewalk. The buildings themselves were made of wood and would not last long due to the threat of fire. By 1888, hydro poles have been connected and single-story buildings have been replaced by two-story structures. By December of 1888, the Alberta Hotel nears completion. The use of sandstone to build the hotel would eventually become an important material in the construction of many of the city's structures. The following year, the Alberta Hotel is completed. By 1902, after a decade of growth, no single-story buildings remain, and stone has almost completely replaced wood. By 1909, the sophistication of the city becomes more and more apparent, and in the same year, tremendous changes are taking place with paved streets, concrete sidewalks, and the introduction of streetcars. By 1912, the automobile makes an early appearance, an influence that would forever change cities around the world.
Looking back, we can see at the tail end of that, but that pre-World War I period was one important point, and of course a crucial point for Calgary's development. Calgary became a city through that period and began to take stock of its potential and attempt to shape it.
Mawson believed that civic architecture should follow in the Edwardian grand manner. His commissioned report was an all-embracing visionary plan for totally redirecting the future course of growth of Calgary. Mawson saw his plan as an integral unit. He felt that few, if any, alterations could be made to the details without the overall plan being ruined.
His plan for the city could not be touched. You fool around with one segment of it and you wreck the holistic viewpoint of the entire design. In other words, you buy it all or you buy nothing. What Mawson wanted was strong European flavour. His buildings were classic in the European design. I don't think he really thought of architecture to suit the environment. I don't think he thought in those terms. And maybe if he had, maybe he would have been taken more seriously. But being an imperial Brit, all he could think of was European imperial type designs. He didn't think of a Western Canadian architectural form for a Western Canadian city. He didn't think that way. He thought in terms of grandness. He thought that town planning was best in the hands of experts and only experts, specifically himself. And in that way, he was typical of his time.
Great European cities owe their roots to centuries of urban development. Paris in particular underwent significant changes under the influence of Napoleon III, but the city's characteristics began even earlier, and city planning was often far from straightforward.
Well, they're very complex. In the case of these old cities, I mean, both Paris and London trace their roots back to Roman times, though in terms of direct planning and architectural influence, that wasn't as much significance, but the growth of those cities as important economic, political centers really begins through the Middle Ages, and they both have at their core remnants of that early medieval development. But the history of Europe really is relatively static in economic terms until the 18th century.
Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries was undergoing tremendous social and economic change. The American historian Walt Rostow coined the phrase, the takeoff into self-sustained growth, to describe the beginning of what we now know as the modern period. London in particular incorporated many of the urban infrastructure that cities are familiar with today.
If you look at the growth of a great city like London, a lot of that really begins in the 18th century. And we have the period of the building of the West End of London with the great Georgian squares and that kind of very civilized, very orderly approach to planning. That was followed through the 19th century when the growth really got underway by the enormous development both of urban areas and of urban problems, because the engineering, the sanitary works, the water supply, the roads were not built in advance in anticipation of this. They were overwhelmed by the growth of, housing, of industry. And the Victorian city is a fascinating study in problems and contrasts and all sorts of issues waiting to be confronted and solved. To think about cities in terms of future growth and in terms of potential visions for how that growth might be shaped. And one of the problems that we have now is that we don't do that kind of thinking. We have moved away from the notion of central direction and public investment in favor of a kind of piecemeal development which depends very much upon private entrepreneurs. And they necessarily are tackling these things at a relatively small scale.
Much of the architecture and design we see today contrasts greatly with the early approaches made by Mawson and others. What was clear in the minds of the early developers has transformed into a state of some confusion.
Mawson came out of a period when there were some very clear visions and some pretty firmly settled convictions about what cities should look like and what a grand city really was. Well, I mean, the grand generalization that I keep coming back to is something that Plato has Socrates saying in the Republic, which is that it is not a trivial question, you know, how is one to live?
Architecture is history in 3 dimensions. It is identity in 3 dimensions. And what he was saying, look who we are. But the who we are was a cross between a Briton, a Frenchman, and a Byzantium, and goodness knows what. I didn't know who we were if we'd built that. Who in the heck are we? You know, and I don't think they'd realise that at the time.
Ethics and aesthetics, the look and the feel and the touch of things and the way in which they give her pleasure are, you know, opposite sides of the same coin. And so the real questions that we face are questions about how are we to live, given what we know about the implications for the future of the way we live now. How are our children to live and our grandchildren to live?
One of the things about architecture, I think, that is of great appeal to most people is that the idea of symbolism. And it's an unusual thing, but most people can read symbols. And one of the reasons I believe that people continue to emulate and admire, for example, New England architecture or the towns and villages of the Maritimes, is that the symbols are very easy to read. The church, the town hall, the marketplace, and so on. And I think there's significant comfort in that. It is, you understand where you are in relation to those symbols of society. And a disturbing thing is happening, I think, again, in the building of our cities, is that the symbolism is becoming very flat.
If architecture is all about identity, and I must admit that our architecture in the city now doesn't say too much about identity, except corporate capitalist identity maybe. But Mawson wouldn't have said a great deal more either. It would have been a European identity, not a North American.
We've got a political system which I think is working against building a great city. That is to say, having the courage to continue to invest in the urban center.
Not to say that suburban building is wrong, but the way we conceive suburbs, the way we build them, needs to be rethought, because they've been based upon a strongly centralized model of services, sewers, water supply, and so on and so forth, and they get built at vast expense as we try to expend these increasingly overloaded systems to service an ever larger area.
We've got a cultural phenomena, which I don't think you can run against it, frankly, of the single-family dwelling and the private garden and two-car garage being within the grasp of 75% of our population.
Calgary is a contradiction in terms, because it has always been a city that hasn't had much respect for its built environment. We don't mind knocking down our built heritage, and that's why urban renewal was so popular in Calgary and other cities. But Calgary's always had this very conscious idea of heritage, always this conscious view of heritage and looking back and celebrating its past. And I think that Mawson, in a way, brought those two things into focus. First of all, he was going to build buildings that would never be torn down, that would have some effect on them, on the policymakers. But at the same time, he was doing that on a city that was always conscious of its heritage. And I'm not sure that they wanted that sort of design. I think if he'd come up with something that was more North American or more traditional, I think that he might have had more success, but he didn't think that way. And I'm just projecting that. I'm just projecting that because I find this a strange contradiction for a city that doesn't seem to value its built environment, yet has always exhibited a strong sense of heritage. And in that sense, its idea for going for Mawson would be okay because it's never seen itself as, it's looked back, it's valued heritage, but it's always said that's where we are. That's gone, that's where we were, and that was good, but now we're here. But we like where we've been, but now we're not here anymore, we're different. And they never saw themselves as a Cowtowner, never. Never saw themselves as saw it 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, but not now. And so since Calgary's always seen itself as on the cutting edge of something, Mawson would have appealed.
When people talk about urban sprawl and worry about cities in general, it's worthwhile asking, what is it that you're really worrying about? And there's a variety of answers to that. I think the one that you often hear is, well, the health of the downtown. If it's a healthy downtown, then it's a healthy city. And people often point to the disasters of the 60s and 70s where important cities like Buffalo and Cleveland and so on lost their downtowns as economic centers. And the cities deteriorated in terms of their economic importance and their intellectual importance in North America. But I think that as important, or a very important consideration in all of this is to really say, well, why do you want a city? Why do you want a city core? And my view on that is that since Greek times, cities, the city meeting place, if you wish, the agora, was a place where democratic government began. And it began on the basis of discourse, and it began on the basis of tolerance and civility. So there are profound reasons, in my view, for having a vital urban center to a congregation of civilization.
The vision of one man or a small group of people, as in the Chicago plan, could create an image for the city, but it was a very static, fixed kind of vision that can't happen now. And we've got to deal with the complexity of many different actors, many different forces, many different sources of investment and interest and insight coming together. And we need a much more flexible, interactive approach to these things.
The lingering effects of this great man, whom I think has been downplayed because of his grandiose schemes and grandiose gestures. And he was a Brit, a British imperialist of the highest order. If it wasn't British, he'd talk about Paris and Vienna, but really he was a Brit true and true, which is probably why Calgary liked him in the first place.
From the early settlement on the banks of the Bow to the skyscrapers that dominate the prairie landscape, Calgary remains a dynamic and changing city. Mawson's vision continues to inspire city planners and developers and is an important legacy as the city moves into the 21st century.
We're obviously growing again very quickly. We're going to be in a period of intensive growth, and the shape of the city is going to be changed again in significant ways.